everyone remembers Trajan's column, the spiral of carved stone rising above Rome, telling the story of two victorious wars against the Dacians in what is now Romania. Emperors, soldiers, bridges, battles, a propaganda masterpiece. But the column never shows you the one thing that actually made those victories possible. It never shows you the food. Think about what Trajan was actually doing between AD 101 and 106. He moved between 100,000 and 150,000 men, soldiers, cavalry, engineers, auxiliaries, slaves, doctors, and support workers, into a mountainous, heavily forested territory hundreds of kilometers beyond the Danube. He kept them there not for weeks, but across two separate campaigns lasting years. He fed them. He armed them. He kept them healthy enough to fight. He kept their animals alive. He replaced what broke. He moved medicine, iron, timber, rope, grain, olive oil, salted pork, vinegar and leather deep into terrain where roads barely existed. Rivers ran wild, and a hostile enemy was actively trying to destroy anything that moved. That is what nobody on that column ever explains. And once you understand the scale of it, you will never look at Roman military history the same way again. If you're watching this on your TV right now, and most of you are, subscribing to the channel takes just a few seconds on your phone. It costs nothing, but it genuinely matters for the channel's growth. And if this kind of hidden history surprises you, share it. Pass it to someone who would never expect to find this fascinating. That's how this channel survives. A Roman legion in the field during Trajan's era consisted of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 legionaries. Add in the auxiliary cohorts that typically accompanied each legion: infantry, cavalry, archers from Syria, Numidian riders from North Africa, Batavian swimmers from the Rhine Delta, and you're looking at a fighting force of around 10,000 to 12,000 men per operational unit. Now multiply that across the multiple legions Trajan assembled for the Dacian campaigns. Historians estimate that the first campaign of 101 involved at least 9 legions plus substantial auxiliary forces. The second campaign in 105 added more. The total military and support personnel pushing into Dacia almost certainly exceeded 100,000 people. Every single one of them needed to eat, every single day. Here is where the numbers become almost incomprehensible. A Roman legionary required approximately 830 grams of grain per day as his base ration. That figure comes from Roman sources and archaeological records of military supply tablets found at forts along the Danube. The grain was issued unprocessed, not as bread, because raw grain resists spoilage far longer than flour. Each soldier received it and ground it himself, using small stone hand mills, quernstones, that every 8-man squad carried as standard equipment. That 830 grams of grain, converted to flour and baked into flat military bread called panis militaris, or boiled into a thick porridge called pulse, provided the caloric foundation of a soldier's day. Beyond grain, the ration included salted pork or bacon, olive oil, vinegar mixed with water in a drink called pasca, dried legumes like lentils and chickpeas, and occasionally cheese or fresh vegetables when local conditions allowed. In total, historians calculate that a Roman soldier on campaign consumed the equivalent of roughly a third of a metric ton of grain per year, multiplied across even a conservative estimate of 100,000 men. Trajan's armies required something in the region of 30,000 to 35,000 metric tons of grain annually just to sustain baseline operations. That is without counting the fodder needed for tens of thousands of horses, mules, and oxen, without counting the olive oil, without counting the salt, the iron, the timber, the leather, the medical supplies, without counting the grain required to feed the support personnel, the muleteers, the slaves, the engineers, the craftsmen, who traveled with the army and without whom nothing worked. The question that should hit you immediately is not how they fought. The question is how they possibly fed themselves. The answer begins not in Dacia, not at the Danube, but hundreds of kilometers away. in the agricultural heartland of the Roman provinces, because before a single soldier crossed into enemy territory, a vast procurement machine had already been running for months, possibly years. The Roman army did not wait until a campaign began to begin feeding it. Trajan spent the winter of 98 AD, 3 years before the First War, personally in Moesia, the Roman province that bordered Dacia across the Danube. Ancient sources confirm he was there inspecting fortifications, planning infrastructure, and organizing supply. This was not ceremonial. This was operational preparation. The Romans understood something that many ancient commanders never grasped. An army that begins its march without pre-positioned supplies is already dying. The procurement system that fed Trajan's Dacian campaigns drew from an enormous geographic arc. Egypt shipped grain north through the port of Alexandria, across the eastern Mediterranean, into the Black Sea, and up the western coast to Musian ports. Sicily and North Africa contributed grain that moved through Ostia, Rome's main port at the mouth of the Tiber, and was then redistributed eastward. The Danubian provinces themselves, Pannonia, Moesia Superior, Moesia Inferior, produced wheat and barley that fed into the military supply chain. Requisitions were placed on local communities in a system the Romans called annona militaris, a structured tax paid in kind, in grain, in animals, in transport services. A local farmer near Viminacium, the great legionary fortress on the Danube in what is now Kostolac, Serbia, would have found Roman officials arriving at his property to assess his harvest and calculate how much of it would be diverted to the army. This was not a request. It was an obligation backed by the weight of imperial authority, and it was calculated, recorded, and tracked with the administrative thoroughness that characterized everything Rome did at scale. The physical backbone of the entire supply operation was the Danube River, and it is impossible to overstate how central it was. The Romans called it the Easter. It stretched for nearly 2,900 kilometers from the Alps to the Black Sea, and along its Musian bank, Rome had been building military infrastructure for decades before Trajan arrived. Fortress towns sat at regular intervals: Singidunum, which is modern Belgrade, Viminacium at Kostolac, Ratiaria at today's Arcar in Bulgaria, Uescus near modern Gigan, Novae near Svistov. Each of these was not simply a military base. Each was also a logistics hub, a warehouse complex, a staging point, and a river port. The fleet that operated on the Danube during the Dacian campaigns was the Classis Flavia Moesica, the Flavian fleet of Moesia. It is depicted in the very first scenes of Trajan's column, where Roman soldiers are shown loading supplies onto river vessels docked outside fortified granary buildings, what scholars identify as Horea, the Roman military warehouse. The ships were not triremes, the great oared warships of the Mediterranean. They were flat-bottomed river craft called liburna, designed specifically for the shallow, fast-moving water of the Danube. They could navigate with a relatively small crew. They could be beached quickly. And critically, they could carry enormous volumes of bulk cargo, grain barrels, oil amphorae, weapon components, rope, timber, far more efficiently and cheaply than any land transport system could manage. The logistics math was simple and brutal. One river barge could carry the equivalent of what would require dozens of ox-drawn wagons on land, and a wagon required a road. A barge required only the river. In a campaign zone where roads barely existed, and where every wheeled vehicle was a liability in mud, rain, or mountain terrain, the Danube fleet was not a supporting element. It was the primary supply artery of the entire operation. But the Danube could only take you so far. At some point, supply had to leave the river and move overland, into the mountains, toward the front. And this is where Roman military engineering performed something that borders on the miraculous. Before the First War even began, Trajan's engineers carved a military road directly into the cliffs of the Iron Gates Gorge, the dramatic canyon where the Danube cuts between the Carpathians and the Balkan Mountains. The gorge was one of the most dangerous stretches of the river, known for its rapids, its rocky currents, and its sheer cliffs that plunged straight into the water. There was no road. There had never been a road, so Rome built one, literally hammering iron beams into the cliff face and laying a wooden walkway along the edge of the gorge, suspended above the churning water below. The inscription commemorating this feat survives to this day on the Serbian bank of the Danube near Ogradina, chiseled into the rock. The Tabula Trajana moved to higher ground in 1972 when the Đerdap hydroelectric dam raised the water levels. It is a simple text. It records that Trajan built the road. What it does not record is how many men working on ropes and scaffolding above a raging river made it happen. This road allowed boats to avoid the most dangerous rapids by being tracked from shore, and it allowed pack animals and foot soldiers to move along the gorge where no wheeled vehicle could ever go. It was a supply corridor cut into solid rock, and it shortened the logistical journey into Dacia considerably. But then came an even larger problem. The Danube itself, crossing one of Europe's greatest rivers with an army of 100,000 men, tens of thousands of animals, and a supply column of incalculable weight, is not a trivial engineering challenge. It is one of the most complex military operations imaginable. In the first campaign of 101, Trajan solved this with pontoon bridges. Temporary floating bridges made of boats lashed together, allowing the army to cross at speed. Trajan's column shows two columns of soldiers marching simultaneously across two different pontoon bridges, almost certainly at or near Viminatium and Singidunum. But for the second campaign in 105, Trajan built something that had never existed before anywhere on Earth. He commissioned a permanent stone and timber bridge across the Danube at Drobeta, today's Drobeta Turnu Severin in Romania, facing Kladovo on the Serbian bank. The architect was Apollodorus of Damascus, arguably the greatest engineer of the ancient world, a man who would go on to design the Forum of Trajan and Trajan's column itself. The bridge he built at Drobeta was 1,135 meters long, 15 meters wide, and 19 meters above the river's surface. It rested on 20 massive stone piers, each standing nearly 45 meters tall from their foundations in the riverbed, taller than a 15-story modern building, with wooden arch spans of approximately 38 meters between each pier. When it was completed in 105 AD, this bridge was the longest arch bridge in the world. It held that record for more than 1,000 years, and its purpose was not symbolic. Its purpose was logistical. Trajan's bridge at Drobeta was a supply highway. It allowed a continuous, weather-independent flow of grain, ammunition, animals, and men into Dacia, without the terrifying vulnerability of pontoon bridges that could be swept away by floods, attacked by river-borne Dacian forces, or iced over in winter. The historian Cassius Dio, writing a century later, described it with astonishment. He calculated the height of the arches and seemed unable to fully believe such a thing had been built. The Romans who participated in its construction carved the names of their units into the bricks. Some of those bricks are still found today near the village of Kostol on the Serbian side of the Danube. Once across the Danube, the supply system had to operate inside enemy territory, across a landscape that combined dense forest, steep mountain ridges, fast-flowing rivers, and seasonal mud that could immobilize any vehicle heavier than a pack mule. A Roman legion on the march was accompanied by its own mobile logistics tail. Each 8-man squad, a contubernium, had mules assigned to carry their leather tent, their hand mills for grinding grain, their entrenching tools, their cooking pots. The standard calculation gives a full legion of around 5,000 to 6,000 men, approximately 1,000 mules for the basic unit-level baggage train alone, before counting the army-level supply train following behind. Multiply across multiple legions and auxiliary forces. Add the ox-drawn wagons carrying siege artillery, the ballistae and onagers, and the supply column stretching behind a marching Roman army was an entity unto itself, sometimes kilometers long, moving at the slowest pace of its slowest animal. The mule was the true workhorse of Roman military logistics. A mule could carry between 100 and 120 kilograms over sustained distances on terrain where a wheeled wagon was useless. It needed less water than a horse, could survive on rougher forage, was more sure-footed on mountain tracks, and resisted disease better than oxen. The Romans knew this. Their supply doctrine built itself around the mule's capabilities. When Trajan's engineers were not building bridges, they were building roads. Packed stone surfaces with drainage channels that kept the surface trafficable even in heavy rain. Specifically designed to handle the constant pounding of laden pack animals and the iron-rimmed wheels of military wagons. Inside Dacia, as the legions advanced toward the Dacian fortresses in the Orashti Mountains, the great highland complex around Sarmizegetusa Regia, the Dacian capital, located in what is today Hunedoara County in Romania. The supply challenge intensified with every kilometer. Longer supply lines meant more vulnerability. More vulnerability meant more escorts, which required more food, which required longer supply lines. It was a logistical feedback loop that had destroyed armies before and would destroy armies again. The Roman answer to this problem was the forward depot, a fortified supply base established at the edge of penetrated territory and restocked by river or road from the Danube base camps. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman military camps established at key points along the Dacian campaign routes. At Tibiscum, near modern Caransebeș in Romania, where the main invasion road turned north into the mountains. At Berzobis, now Berzovia, at points along the Mureș River Valley, which provided one of the few navigable routes deep into the Dacian heartland. These were not temporary overnight camps. They were fortified logistics nodes with granaries, animal pens, repair workshops, and sometimes field hospitals. The Horea, the Roman military granary, was a building of remarkable engineering sophistication. It was rectangular, with thick stone or timber walls, raised floors supported on pillars to allow air circulation underneath and prevent moisture and rot from destroying the stored grain, and narrow windows set high on the walls to maintain cool temperatures and deter rodents. A single large military harem could store thousands of modii of grain. Roman military records from forts along Hadrian's Wall in Britain, which used similar logistic systems, give us reference points for the scale of storage these buildings could achieve. The floor-raising system worked so well that grain stored in Roman Horea could remain usable for months, sometimes years. This was not accident. It was engineering deliberately designed for the extended timelines of imperial military operations. But let us be honest about the fragility built into this system. Because the supply chain for the Dacian campaigns was not a smooth, uninterrupted flow. It was a machine operating under constant threat of breakdown. The Dacians understood logistics. Decebalus, their king, a general whom the Romans themselves described as shrewd, disciplined, and strategically sophisticated, knew that if he could not defeat the legions in pitched battle, he could attack the system that fed them. Dacian raiding parties, fast-moving and intimately familiar with the terrain, targeted Roman supply columns, ambushed foraging parties, and attempted to destroy the infrastructure the Romans were building. Trajan's column shows this directly. In one of its early scenes, Dacian forces are depicted attacking the Roman frontier along the Moesian limes, while the army was still organizing, forcing the Classis Moesica fleet to rush supplies and reinforcements to besieged garrisons. The war on the supply chain was as real as the war on the battlefield, and it required the Romans to allocate significant numbers of combat troops, not to fighting forward, but to guarding the rear. The terrain itself was an adversary. The Carpathian Mountains receive heavy snowfall, and the campaign season in Dacia was brutally limited. The first campaign ran from 101 to 102, and the Romans had to achieve sufficient operational momentum before winter turned the mountain passes into lethal death traps. Extended supply lines in mountain snow were not merely difficult, they were potentially fatal. The army's operational speed was directly constrained by the rate at which supply could move. And in the mountains of Dacia, that rate dropped catastrophically in bad weather. Roman soldiers worked in shifts to keep roads passable. Bridges were repaired within hours of damage. Engineers marched with the advance units specifically so that infrastructure could be built as the army moved, rather than after. There was another hidden vulnerability that almost never appears in histories of the campaign: the animals themselves. A pack mule required feed equivalent to roughly half what a human soldier consumed. An ox required substantially more. A cavalry horse required the most. Across an army of 100,000 men with tens of thousands of animals, the daily fodder requirement was astronomical. In enemy territory, where you could not freely forage, because Dacian forces were watching and the land had been emptied of supplies by its own population ahead of the Roman advance. Carrying sufficient fodder for the animals while simultaneously carrying sufficient food for the men created an almost impossible weight equation. The animal supply chain was consuming a substantial fraction of its own cargo just to sustain itself. If fodder ran out before the next supply convoy arrived, animals began to weaken. Weakened animals carried less. Supply deliveries slowed. The soldiers went short. The cascade had no natural stopping point. This was not a hypothetical risk. Armies across history have been paralyzed by exactly this problem. The Romans avoided it, barely, and through a combination of ruthless planning, pre-positioned depots, and the operational discipline to execute resupply schedules regardless of combat conditions. But the margin was never as comfortable as Trajan's column suggests. The medical dimension of the supply chain is another piece that almost nobody discusses, and it was enormous. A Roman legion on campaign maintained a valetudinarium, a field hospital. As standard organizational doctrine, field hospitals meant doctors, medical instruments, bandages made from linen, medicines derived from herbs, plants, and minerals sourced from across the empire. Dioscorides, the great Roman military physician, documented hundreds of medicinal substances in active military use during this period. Wine vinegar for wound cleaning, resin from pine trees for sealing wounds, opium for pain, various plant extracts for fever and infection. These were not optional luxuries. They were logistics requirements tracked through the same supply system as grain and iron. Roman surgical instruments recovered archaeologically from military sites, including a remarkable set found at Bingen am Rhein in Germany, dating from the same period as the Dacian campaigns, show a sophistication that would not be matched in European military medicine for another 1,500 years. Scalpels, bone drills, arterial clamps, catheters, retractors. The Romans performed amputations, removed arrowheads, drained abscesses, set broken bones with splints. All of this required trained personnel, specialized equipment, and a supply chain that kept the hospitals stocked with what they needed to function. Trajan's column itself shows medical personnel treating wounded soldiers on the battlefield, one of the very few ancient military monuments to depict combat medicine at all. Now let us reach the moment where the system came closest to its true limit. The siege of Sarmizegetusa Regia, the Dacian capital, located in the highland sanctuary of the Oreshti Mountains in what is today Hunedoara County, Romania, at an elevation of roughly 200 meters above sea level, represented the absolute outer edge of what Roman military logistics could sustain. The city sat behind a network of fortified Dava settlements, stone walls, and natural barriers. Getting there required pushing a full operational force, with its entire supply tail, over mountain terrain that had been specifically designed by the Dacians to be as logistically difficult as possible. In 106 AD, during the Second Campaign, the Romans cut off the water supply to Sarmizegetusa Regia, a detail confirmed by ancient sources, and laid siege. Maintaining a siege requires a peculiar kind of logistical discipline. Unlike a moving army, which can forage opportunistically as it advances, a besieging army stays in one place and must have everything delivered to it. Every calorie, every piece of iron, every medical supply, every replacement tool had to travel from the Danube base, through the mountain roads, through the forward depots, to the siege lines around the Dacian capital. For weeks, without interruption, while Dacian counterattack forces attempted to break the encirclement. The city fell. Decebalus fled and, faced with capture, committed suicide. A moment preserved in one of Trajan's column's most famous scenes. But the fall of the capital was not simply a military victory. It was a logistics victory. Rome won because its supply system outlasted the Dacians' ability to resist. when the food inside the city ran out, and when the Romans outside it remained supplied, the outcome was only a matter of time. What happened in the aftermath of the campaign reveals something even more about Rome's understanding of systems. In 106 AD, with Dacia formally annexed as a Roman province, the empire did not dismantle the logistics infrastructure it had built to conquer it. It upgraded and permanentized it. Trajan's bridge at Drobeta continued to operate as a supply artery for the new province. The forward depots became permanent garrison towns. The military roads built through the mountains were extended and improved, eventually connecting Dacia into the imperial road network. New colonies were founded. Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa, built near the ruins of the Dacian capital, became the administrative center of the province, and they were populated partly with Roman veterans who settled there as a permanent military reserve. The supply chain that had fed the conquest became the supply chain that fed the occupation. Dacia produced gold and silver in quantities that justified every logistical effort. The mines of the Apuseni Mountains, the gold of the Murish River, the silver of what is now the Transylvanian Basin. These resources began flowing back toward Rome immediately upon conquest. Trajan's column shows the famous scene of Dacian gold and silver being loaded for transport. Historians estimate that the gold and silver captured from Dacia, from the treasury of Decebalus, which was found hidden in a diverted river according to ancient sources, and from the mines that Rome then operated, may have amounted to something in the region of 165 metric tons of gold and 330 metric tons of silver. These figures from ancient sources should be treated with caution, and modern scholars debate them, but even at a fraction of those numbers, the return on investment was extraordinary. Trajan used the Dacian wealth to fund a building program in Rome that included the Forum, the markets, the column, and a massive distribution of money to Roman citizens, the so-called congiarium. The logistics machine had paid for itself, and then some. But here's the thing that stays with you long after you've processed all the numbers, all the engineering, all the grain calculations and mule trains and river fleets. Almost none of the people who made it work have names. We know Apollodorus of Damascus because he designed the bridge and the column and the forum. We know Trajan because he was the emperor. We know Decebalus because he was the enemy. We know Claudius Livianus because he was the Praetorian prefect who accompanied the campaign. These names survived because they were powerful men. But the system was built and run by people whose names vanished completely. The grain procurement officers who calculated the harvest assessments across Moesian farms. The sailors of the Classis Moesica who moved supply barges up the Danube through winter ice. The muleteers. The colons, who led the pack animals over mountain tracks in the rain, night after night, because the army's survival depended on what was strapped to their animals' backs. The engineers who hung suspended above the Iron Gates Gorge, hammering iron beams into cliff face to carve a road from stone. The men who poured the mortar into the forms that became the 20 piers of Trajan's bridge, standing in the current of one of Europe's great rivers with tools and techniques that the world would not see matched again for over 1,000 years. The doctors who removed arrows from soldiers' bodies in field hospitals that no ancient monument thought worthy of a dedicated image. The bakers who ran the field ovens. The record keepers who tracked every modius of grain, every animal lost, every wagon wheel repaired. Trajan's column shows 2,762 individual human figures in its carved scenes. It is one of the most detailed military records surviving from antiquity. And the invisible people who kept the army fed, healed, and moving are almost nowhere in it. History celebrates the results of systems while forgetting the people who ran them. The Dacian wars were won on the battlefield, yes, but they were made possible in warehouses, on river barges, along mountain supply roads, in granaries that no longer exist, in record books that turned to dust centuries ago. Empires do not fall when their armies lose battles. They fall when the systems behind those armies stop working. Rome understood this more clearly than almost any civilization before or since, and built its dominance not on the courage of its soldiers alone, but on the organizational genius of people whose names we will never know. That is the real legacy of the Dacian Wars. Not the column, Not the bridge, not the gold. The system